So I think we are more or less plateaued on folks coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you so much, everyone on the call, for joining the second meeting for the Women Who Stay series. Before we get started with our speaker this evening, I'm going to turn it over to Ann Kester for just a moment. And if you'd like to take over for a few minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. So for those of you who have been participating in the Women Who Stay initiative for a while, both when we began as a Bible study and then onto our Zoom period, you know that Bill Plant was a very regular participant in the Women Who Stay, along with his wife, Robin Smith. Again, both when we met in McKenna for Bible study, and then we would see Bill and Robin together on Zoom. And Bill was just such a wonderful supporter of this initiative, and certainly a wonderful supporter of women in the church. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Bill Plant's passing this past Wednesday, the 28th. Just a wonderful parishioner, regular at the 11:30 Mass, a lector. He was certainly a very accomplished professional individual. You may have seen news coverage about Bill's passing. He was a White House reporter, is with CBS News for 52 years. But with all of that, we appreciated Bill for being Bill in Holy Trinity, and all that he did for the parish, and again, all that he did to support the Women Who Stay. So I ask you to, keep Bill in your prayers, keep Robin Smith in your prayers as she goes through this time of grieving, and all of Bill's family. He will be dearly missed.
Thank you so much, Anne. So again, thank you all so much for joining us on the call today. I'll go ahead and kick us off. If you haven't already, please ensure that your computer is on mute or your phone is on mute, depending on how you've joined us this evening, just to try and minimize background noise. And we are, of course, as always, very happy to take questions and comments throughout the course of our conversation this evening. Please use the chat function, and as we have appropriate breaks, we'll make sure that those questions and comments are answered, or we'll save them to the end, depending on how we're doing on timing. So again, please make sure you're on mute, and please type in your questions in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation this evening. And with that, I will introduce our speaker. So welcome and thank you so much to Brenna Davis, who is our speaker this evening. Brenna is currently serves as the Director of Integral Ecology at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. She is a Boston College graduate, former Jesuit volunteer, a Covenant Companion with the Sisters of Humility of Mary, and a certified spiritual director. Brenna has certification as a Cuyahoga County Master Recycler, is a member of NCR's Earthgate Advisory Panel, and a board member for the Jesuit Retreat Center in Parma, Ohio, and Bethlehem Farm in Penn Springs, West Virginia. So very impressive background, and we are very excited to hear from her this evening. So with that, I will turn it over to Brenna, and let me get the screen started so we can start your presentation.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And you did a really good job pronouncing Cuyahoga. Like a lot of people.
Thank you.
I never think about that being in my bio and it being a tricky word, but I live in Cleveland, Ohio. So we're in Cuyahoga County. And so tonight specifically, I am hoping that we can have a bit of a conversation about this concept of integral ecology. So like Amanda said, I am now the full-time director of integral ecology at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And for those of you who aren't familiar, ISN is a lay-led nonprofit that works with parishes and Jesuit high schools and universities nationally to do justice programming. And so I just transitioned to a full-time ecology role, and we're very excited about that. And as a spiritual director, I just think that Ignatian spirituality has really enriched my understanding of ecology and justice. So I'm looking forward to kind of talking about the interplay of these three threads in my work and in our shared work. Thanks, Amanda. Go to the next slide. Amanda, you can go to the next slide. Sorry. Oh, and actually, can we go backwards? I think I had my prayer slides before the title slide. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. And back one more. Amanda, it was wonderful because I thought that I could see my slides and my notes at the same time and realized I couldn't. So thank you so much. So whenever I begin a session, with opening prayer, I always like to start with a land acknowledgement. And so I just share one for the land where I reside. As you may or may not know, land acknowledgement is just a recognition, a sense of truth telling that the land where we live now is stolen land, and that this is just a moment to do a little truth telling, which we're going to talk more about today. So, in recognizing the land upon which I reside, I express deep gratitude to the Native people who lived and worked here before me, those whose stewardship and resilient spirits have sustained this sacred land, which is the traditional homeland of the Erie, Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. I think that it's important in a land acknowledgement to also acknowledge that there are Native people and Indigenous people who currently live on this land. And some of the things that they've done recently is they were the Lake Erie Native American Council was integral to changing the name of our baseball team here in Cleveland. So we are now the Guardians, which is, I think, a win for our city and for everyone. So just deep gratitude for the work in the past and the ongoing work of the Indigenous people in this area. You can go to the next slide, Amanda. And so for opening prayer today, it is the final day, I guess, of the season of creation. It's cool to get to do this on St. Francis Day Eve. And so I just wanted to use the scripture that we've been using for the season of creation. For those of you who may not be aware, the season of creation runs from September 1st to October 4th, and is just a season, kind of an ecumenical season in the church where we really uplift the gift of creation. And so this year's season of creation theme was listen to the voice of creation. And what's really important about that, that they really emphasize this year is that many voices are being muted in public discourse around climate change. And so the voices of people who are most directly susceptible and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In addition, the voices who hold generational wisdom about how to live gratefully within the limits of the land. And so, and then also the voices of biodiversity that exist in this world. So we're just taking a moment to listen to the voice of the earth. And this passage from Exodus was the scripture passage that the theme was centered around. So I just invite you to take a few deep breaths and to just get comfortable and to center yourself. I'm going to read this scripture passage. We'll just do it one time. And I invite you to really kind of imagine yourself in this passage. So really, St. Ignatius invites us to always use our imagination. And so as I'm reading this, I invite you to think about sights and sounds and smells and, textures that you might feel. Okay, so now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. So if you don't already have your eyes closed, I invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable, and to just take a moment to really plant your feet firmly on the ground where you are, if you are able. And as you do this, I invite you to just take a few breaths and to remember that the place where you are is also sacred ground. And as you really take a moment to be embodied and to feel the texture of the ground below your feet, just invite you to think back over the past few days or weeks, and to just let images come to your mind like different scenes from a movie. And consider, how have you experienced the land where you are as holy? What makes this land holy? And how has it sustained you? I invite you now to also consider, where have you heard the voice of creation? Through people or the earth? Maybe it's moments in nature, your family, beloved pet, people you work with. What are these small moments that stand out in your mind that have allowed you to hear the voice of creation? Finally, Moses says, Here I am, when God calls him. And Moses does not feel ready or worthy for the task that God has set before him to go set his people free from slavery in Egypt. But Moses still says, Here I am. And so here you are, here we are. So I just invite you in closing to consider how God is calling you to respond to the voice of creation. How God is inviting you to set the world free at this particular moment in time when we are all alive together. So you might want to lift up a word or a phrase silently to God. Maybe you want to share a word or phrase in the chat that is coming to you, but we lift up all of these hopes and dreams and great big things that we imagine for a more just and sustainable future. Amen. Great, thank you. I invite you to come back into the space to take a moment. And Amanda, whenever you're ready, you can skip ahead 2 slides. So I do always, like when I begin any ecological talk, and and Jane, I see, says that the kitchen floor is sacred ground. Yeah, that's really beautiful, right? Where you make all of these meals to nourish your body, to nourish maybe people in your community. So I just like to begin with an acknowledgement of context, and it's just really a moment where we settle into the truth that the reality and the context in which we gather. So we are living in a time when the human species is having an unprecedented impact on our planet. And so we just like take a moment to say this and to name it as a reminder that the discussion that we have here and the decisions that we make and the actions that we take as a result of our time here together will have consequences for future and current generations and species. And so that's important. It's important that we are here together. So thank you for taking the time to be here. Thanks, Amanda. Next slide. So I am a former teacher, and I always like to kind of share kind of what I'm thinking, or the 3 things that we're going to talk about. So the first thing that I just want to briefly share about is the gift of the encyclical Ladocity and the Ladocity action platform. The second thing I'm going to focus on is this gift of Ecological spirituality as it relates to ecology and how it enhances ecological justice and kind of love for creation. And then finally, the third movement will be to explore how this concept of integral ecology invites us to move towards justice in our own lives. So next slide, Amanda. So to begin, if anyone hasn't read Ladocity, it is an encyclical by Pope Francis, so that's a letter, and Ladocity means praise be to you. And as I was trying to think of a picture of like what brings out this like great sense of praise, I just got to go to Yosemite for the first time ever this year for work, and I was gonna put like a fancy picture of like a mountain in Yosemite, but then I saw this picture of my cat. This is Fran. This is just on my front sidewalk right in front of my house. I was sitting in my hammock, and I was working one day, and Fran just like paused and was just staring up in the tree above me at a bird, and she was just like captivated. And it was just this tiny little moment of kind of a sense of praise, or just a sense of reverence for creation, that kind of washed over me as I was like frantically sitting at my laptop and typing for work, right? So this idea that this orientation of gratitude towards God and for all of creation is central to Ladocity and what it means. Gratitude, we're going to talk more about that later. That's something that St. Ignatius often talks about. And so I just think that it's a very beautiful interconnection, and it is really, you can see that Pope Francis is a Jesuit, right? When we talk about this orientation. And so this letter was published in 2015, and it's just about the current state of our common home and the church's historical support of caring for creation, and then our call as Christians and people of goodwill to respond to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And in 2020, it was the 5-year anniversary of Ladocity. So it was COVID year and also Ladocity year. And at the end of that, Pope Francis launched the Ladocity action platform. So actually, Amanda, if you could go to the next slide. The dynamics of Ladocity that we see in the platform, I think the kind of 3 main dynamics that we are invited to engage in are integral ecology, and I'm going to talk more about this, but this idea that everything is interconnected. Ecological conversion, so how have I had this kind of personal experience of feeling and knowing myself to be interconnected with all that is on this planet and with God, and in light of that understanding, how what is my natural response of love, right? So when we also think of the spiritual exercises, the fourth week of the spiritual exercises is, how am I being called as someone who is loved and as someone who has been gifted with so much to then go out into the world and respond likewise in love. And so Ladocity talks about a lot of environmental issues, but at the heart, I think those are kind of like the central spiritual messages of the letter. And you can go to the next slide, Amanda. Thank you. And so for the Ladocity action platform, you may be familiar with this, so I'm sorry if this is repetitive, but St. Ignatius also loves repetition. So this is maybe great. So the Ladocity action platform is an invitation for 7 sectors of the church to address these 7 goals in the next 7 years, and to create a very concrete action plan related to the 7 goals. So at the Ignatian Solidarity Network in the past year, we had a series called Renewing the Earth, where we explored one of the goals each month in conversation with an element of Ignatian spirituality, just to kind of help us figure out and discern what are maybe our next steps as we look at these goals. And so I think that this is really an invitation to take back some of our power and to have some agency, and to say, even if things aren't changing with federal policy as quickly as we would like, we are a part of communities where we can really use some agency and make some of these changes. So Amanda, we can go to the next slide. And so, like I said, to begin with, Laudato Si starts with this sentiment of praise, and that comes from the Canticle of Creation. So the first lines from that canticle from St. Francis are "Praise be to you," and so that's where Pope Francis took the words. And so, as we can see, St. Ignatius also says, as we think about how this intersects with Ignatian spirituality, that ingratitude is the cause and beginning and origin of all evil and sin, right? And so when we think about the state of our world today, we are really lacking in kind of the sense of an orientation towards gratitude, right? I think that the speed with which we move it's just, when you stop to think about it, it's quite amazing. There's a book that I really love. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's called Station 11. It's by Emily St. John Mandel. And I read it. It's about a pandemic. I read it before the pandemic. I don't know how I would have felt about reading it during the pandemic, and they've since turned it into a TV show, so you can watch that if you're interested. But one of my favorite scenes from that is the thesis of this book, or the idea, is that there's a pandemic that wipes out 99% of humanity. And so there's a point at which, near the end, there is an airport, and in this airport they have all of these relics of the time before. And so, for example, they have a cell phone in a glass case, and one of the kids is like, "What is that, Mom?" And she's explaining, "Oh, well, you used to be able to turn that on and you could talk to anybody anywhere in the world, or you could find any information that you needed instantaneously in seconds," right? And it's that sense of awe that you see kind of as this woman is explaining this to a child, and I could be misremembering, but Emily St. John Mandel writes it beautifully, right? It just when I read that scene, it really gave me pause, right? We live in this really amazing time where we have so much, not that technology is the only thing to be grateful for, but that we have so much. And I think because we have so much, the threat is, the challenge is that we can easily take it for granted, right? And so that's why St. Ignatius invites us to do that examine every day, to say, what am I grateful for, right? Because when I am coming, I know in my own life, from a place of ingratitude, it's really hard for me to experience awe, and to experience transcendence, and to experience empathy and compassion for people around me. So really, this is an important call in this moment. How do we bring this sense of awe and gratitude to life again as we think about these ecological issues? Amanda, we can go to the next slide. Thanks. The other piece of Ignatian spirituality that I think is so central right now is this idea of the magis, right? And so this idea that frontiers and boundaries, this is like a very Jesuit thing, right? Frontiers and boundaries are not obstacles or ends, but new challenges to be faced, new opportunities to be welcomed, right? And it's an opportunity to not be content with the status quo. And I think, especially with the ecological issues that we're facing, I'm in a lot of ecological circles. I don't know what everyone, what everyone's kind of main passion is. But I think that we have this like shiny object syndrome, and I'll talk about this again, but like the problem is so big that like anytime you get in a room with people who are concerned about climate change and ecology, it's like 50 different things get mentioned. And sometimes we feel like we frantically have to do everything. And I think that, again, this call of the Magis, not to do more, but to do what brings greater glory and to kind of deepen that work, is a call that we really need right now. And Amanda, we can go to the next slide. And this idea that I think, again, that we can be really overwhelmed. And sometimes I think, especially as women in the church, right? Like it can kind of feel like, or we had that reading from Timothy yesterday in the scriptures, like we need to fan the flames, right? And Magis is the fire, the fervor in action, awakening those who have become dormant, right? And I think that with everything that is happening in the world, especially in like a post-COVID landscape, it can feel really easy to be overwhelmed and feel paralyzed. But Magis is really calling us to become aware and to become alive to ourselves again, and to remember the great gifts that God gave us and to experience those with gratitude. Because again, when we're feeling grateful, we want to share. We want to share those things more. And I think especially now more than ever, we know that there are so many women in the church who have great gifts to share that the world needs, and there aren't always the structures in place to cultivate those gifts. But I think now is the time that we need a bountiful harvest. And so we are all invited into this kind of deepening and discernment about our gifts and how we're called to use them. And Amanda, we can go to the next slide. And so again, kind of in that same way, so when we really listen deeply, we can think about what is my vocation, right? So this problem is so big, and that's bad news. But the good news is that means that you have a talent or a skill that is needed to address climate change, to address this historic moment that we are in. And really what we are being called to is a deepening discernment of how are my gifts and my talents best being used in conversation with the community, and being shared to bring about a more just world. So we can go to the next slide, Amanda. And I think that I always think about this prayer that is attributed to Saint Oscar Romero, right? We cannot do everything, and there's a sense of liberation in realizing that, and it enables us to do something and to do it very well. And every time I read this line, I immediately think of Magis and discernment and really deciding what is going to bring about greater glory, but not just add more kind of frenetic energy to the world, because we need to be, as we think about holy ground right now, we need to be deeply grounded in the places where we are, and really cultivating that sense of, okay, how am I being called next? How are we collectively as a community being called? Which is a bit of what the Ladocity Action Platform is asking us to do, and the Synod on Synodality is asking us to do, is really to discern and have those conversations individually, but also as a community. And we can go to the next slide, Amanda. And then I'm just going to talk about two more Ignatian spirituality concepts. And you know, the one that is near and dear to my heart is God in all things. And I think that this just connects with ecology and integral ecology so well. This is a photo from Brophy Prep. It's a school in Phoenix, Arizona, a Jesuit school, and their Native American club at the school for the past few years has been partnering with the Apache strongholds. So some of you may be aware of this, but the Apache people and other indigenous communities in the area have sacred land that is known as Oak Flat. And there's currently a mining company, a copper mining company, that was given a deed to the land to be able to mine on the land. And so this is going to destroy the sacred site for so many people, right? And so the students from the Brophy Prep Native American Club have responded to this call to actually go and pray with the Apache stronghold. So they did a run where they ran like 180 miles collectively from Phoenix to this land. And then where they also had kind of a spiritual celebration together. And I think that I have just taken so much inspiration from their advocacy work and just also from their kind of their communal celebration and their communal outreach, right? To say it's not like Brophy is going to go do its own thing, but like, how do we work together in this moment and listen to the voice of the earth and the voice of the people who are being impacted, and how do we support what they are asking us to do? And I just see God in that, right? Like God is inherent in that relationship and in that, that call to respond to the needs of our neighbors. And then we can go to the next slide, Amanda. And then the final concept that I just wanted to briefly mention is one of freedom. So when we think about the ecological crisis that we are in right now, especially as we think about probably our, most of the people in this room, I don't know everybody's context, but we are most of us, I assume, living in the United States, I assume, from middle class to somewhat affluent backgrounds, right? And so really right now, what we are called to do is to think about freedom. What kind of freedom do we need in the United States as one of the largest historic emitters of carbon emissions, as people who have taken more than our fair share of the Earth's resources? Freedom from consumption, freedom from messages that tell us we don't have enough or that we need something to fill a particular kind of spiritual hole in our own lives. And so I just think that this concept of freedom, especially as we're thinking about a just and equitable climate future and kind of the reign of God on earth, we are probably going to have to, this is another word people don't like, but sacrifice, right? We're going to have to sacrifice a little bit. And so I just think St. Ignatius's concept of freedom and what do I personally need to be freed from? And then what do we, again, collectively as a country need to be freed from fossil fuels, from extractivism, from creating sacrifice zones in some communities so that other people can prosper and have everything that they need, right? So again, I think this is a central concept from Ignatian spirituality that can be applied to kind of this ecological context and moment that we're living in. We can go to the next slide, Amanda. And so then we're kind of moving to the third point now. So I'm gonna wrap it up soon. I've been talking a lot since we started with prayer. But this concept of integral ecology is very central to Ladocity. And when we were transitioning my position in ecology from part-time to full-time, I was very passionate about the idea that this position be the director of integral ecology. And what integral ecology means to me is that, that everything is interconnected and that we know that there are systems involved, right? So when we're talking about the environment, we cannot talk about that without talking about economic, political, and social systems. At ISN, we have three main issue areas: racial justice, ecological justice, and migration justice. And we can't talk about one of those without talking about the others, right? I think that we have seen, when we think about something being integral, something that I really like to think about is wholeness, right? So like integral is being whole. And so since we know that everything is interconnected and we are trying to move towards wholeness, we have to be willing to see those interconnections. So we see that, the dry corridor in Guatemala is experiencing longer droughts. And so we know that some of the unaccompanied minors who were detained at the US-Mexico border were fleeing from that drought, right? Because their families could no longer farm. We also see the way that some migrants are being treated is with racism and xenophobia, right, at our border. And so that's just one example of how all of these issues are interconnected. And so to address one is to really try to address them all. And I think also something that is important about integral ecology is truth telling, right? So we're having a lot of conversations, I would say, in the Jesuit world about truth telling and about reconciliation and healing. So when we think about the Georgetown descendants, even though there is a lot of controversy about how that process is going, when we think about the healing and truth telling that is happening at Red Cloud Indian School with Macaw Black Elk, right? And with the Jesuit conference, I think that it's important to tell the truth and to, name that because of the sin and legacy of slavery and genocide in our country, that we have systems that are unjust, and particularly environmental racism we can see manifest in places like Jackson, Mississippi, right, where there was no water infrastructure and where people were living without access to clean water in our country, in a capital city that is 80% Black. Right. So that is not an accident. That has happened because of our history. And so we need to tell that truth as we talk about environmental issues. We know that there are sacrifice zones in our country like Cancer Alley, where a lot of our oil is refined. And Sharon Levine has just won like so many awards, but she is the founder of Rice St. James, lives in that neighborhood, and has been doing activism on the ground to try to stop a plastics company from moving in. And we just got good news that there are signs that permits are being pulled, and that's not going to happen, right? So we know that all of these issues are interconnected, and that floods in Pakistan and fires and droughts in the West and hurricanes worsening are all connected to economic, political, and social structures. And so that's a piece of what integral ecology is calling us to name and to truth tell in order to move towards healing and wholeness. We can go to the next slide. And so I think that, again, this image of like a spider web or of understanding, right, that like if you tug at one piece over here, it's going to affect the whole system. We have to remember that we were created and that creation is good, right? So praise be. And we are here because of our loving God who has a big imagination. And so we are invited to be a living extension of that imagination, and to find creative ways to respond to sustain this network that we are a part of, right? And to imagine bigger than the status quo and to be co-creators of new systems that can really bring integral wholeness to our ecological system. And something that I love from the season of creation last year is they focused on this idea of oikos, the Greek word for home. It's the root for eco, so like ecology and economics. And so when we think of ecology, it's really all about the study of our home, of where we are from. Sometimes we can really separate ourselves or say ecology is about nature and nature's out there and I'm in here, right? But we're really not separate, right? We are a part of this system, and that is something that we are being invited to remember. And we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so the last image that I wanted to leave you with is one that I have just it's captured my imagination. And like I said, if St. Ignatius has taught me anything, it's that when your imagination is speaking to you, that is God. God is present there. So this is an image of mycelium. So mycelium are just like fungus that grow on the roots of trees. And I was reading about this in this book called Finding the Mother Tree, and which was written by a woman who is an arborist. And so there used to be this myth that in forests, it was all about survival of the fittest, that like trees were competing for resources and trying to like suck up the water and suck up the sugar, and everybody was just trying to survive. But actually what scientists have found is that cooperation is at the center of forests. So mycelium grow on the roots. So they're like a whole different, species from the trees, and they grow on the roots of the trees. And say an ash tree at a point in the year when it's really struggling to get resources, if a cedar tree has an abundance, through the mycelium, they're able to transfer that abundance to the ash so that it can survive. And vice versa. So when the cedar tree is suffering, the ash tree can provide the nutrients that it needs. And so it is this system of mutual sharing, which I just think has captured my imagination as I think about the transition that we need to make to build resilient communities and to transition away from kind of this idea of extractivism of I'm going to take everything that I need, right? But to a space and more than I need, right? To a space of like, oh, I have extra, let me share that with you so that we can all survive. Because I think what's really beautiful is that we know that forests create their own microclimates, right? So when all of these trees are able to survive and stand together, they're able to create a microclimate that is hospitable. And I've been talking to a lot of parishes and schools about that idea of how do we build coalitions across justice issues? So it's not just like, those are the ecology people, those are the racial justice people, those are the migration people, because sometimes the climate is not hospitable. I know that at Holy Trinity, you all are blessed, and you have a kind of an administration that supports all of this justice work. But in some places, right, like a priest changes or a principal changes and the climate becomes hostile, right? And it's easy for someone to say, oh, that ecology stuff, we don't care about it. But I think that their nature is giving us this reminder and this invitation to say, no, when we stand together, when we support each other, when we work together and collaborate, we can create this really beautiful climate that will sustain life. So can move to the next slide. So I go back to the 7 goals just briefly to say that this is the Ladocity Action Platform is a reminder that we are invited to use our agency and to act in all of the ways that we are called through our individual vocations, and then also collectively. I think it's really important to remember that, like in this Zoom room, there is a lot of wisdom present to respond to this moment. And, we need to listen to the experts, but we don't need to depend on experts to make changes. Like we have that power within us. And I think that the beauty of these 7 goals is, again, they provide many different entry points. So as I think about, something like a plastic water bottle and the 7 goals of the Ladocity Action Platform, when we think of a response to the cry of the earth, we can think of how the earth and the people are impacted where oil is extracted and refined. So like in Cancer Alley. When we think of the cry of the poor, again, we can think about communities that are being impacted by refineries or having water taken from their community to go into bottled water. We can think about ecological economics. We can think about, this is kind of a crazy system that we have this beautiful gift from God that is free, and then we take it from people and then we sell it back to them for more money. Like, could we have a more circular system that doesn't require so much extracting? Is there a better way to keep our communities and economy healthy? Then when we think of adoption of sustainable lifestyles, if we're thinking of a plastic water bottle, it's like, oh, well, I know I should recycle this or I shouldn't use it. But really, when we think about all of these pieces before and we see how one water bottle is interconnected to so many communities that we are a part of a greater web and connected to, it makes the opportunity to opt out of that a bit more meaningful. And then we can educate people about all of these pieces of this kind of cycle, and we can do something spiritual with it. So in my parish, we do what is called a litter pilgrimage once a month, where we walk around and we pick up trash. And like me, I am very much of the mindset we need to do more than pick up trash in this particular historic moment. But what we do when we do that is we pray for people who have been impacted by this piece of trash, from extraction to disposal, right? And so we are able to kind of, again, form this connection with the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And then finally, community engagement and participatory action. Like, that's where we're being called. We're being called to discern how are our talents and how can our wisdom be used to help solve this crisis, and how can we imagine kind of a better world, a healthier world. And so we can go to the next slide, Amanda. So this is Paul Campion. And when I think about ecological imagination, he is one of my heroes. He graduated from Loyola Chicago and also from Gonzaga High School. So maybe some of you know him and his family. I don't know where they went to church, but Paul is a part of the Sunrise Movement now. And he last year in November went on a hunger strike outside of the White House to demand a change to climate legislation, to demand that legislation was passed to meet the particular moment. And so I called Paul while he was like 4 days into not eating solid food. And it also seemed like Joe Manchin was not going to change his mind about Build Back Better. And so I was like, Paul, like, how are you doing? Also, how are you doing this? Like, how are you sustaining yourself? And something that he said really kind of like flipped a switch in my brain. He said, there's so much to win. He was like, I want to imagine a world where my future children can go to a park and there won't be a drought or a heat wave. I want to imagine a world where all of my friends can have good jobs that are good for the planet. And he just started laying out like kind of all of these dreams for the world, and this world that he could see. And meanwhile, I had just, and this is also fine, I had just written a litany for the 23 species that were declared extinct, right? And so I just had this realization that I was really getting stuck in what we had already lost. And Paul was inviting me to expand my imagination and say, like, but what do we have to win? What kind of world can we create? And it makes me think, and this is really, really the last thing I'll say, of this Thomas Merton quote. And he says, Christian hope begins where all other hope stands frozen in fear of the unspeakable. And for me, that means that our work starts where all hope is lost, right? And I would say with our current climate crisis, like, we're kind of there, like we're in a really tough spot. And so there is a chance that we just get paralyzed and overwhelmed and don't take action, or there's a chance that we dig into our spiritual tradition, into Ignatian spirituality, into gratitude, into the Magis, into ecological imagination, and just imagining the world that we want to see, and that we trust that we can bring about a more just, a more sustainable world and the reign of God in this world. So with that is kind of my hope and dream, and my hope for your community, that you can find ways to collectively discern how to bring about this more just world, and to, practice using your imagination for the type of world that we believe is possible in the future. And that we can build a network of resiliency, right, to support each other as we're doing these initiatives in our community. So with that, I will stop talking. Thank you so much. There is one more slide with something I want to share later, Amanda, but I think we can end it for now, and because I've talked a lot, but thank you so much.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Brenna. I invite folks to please either come off mute to ask questions, or feel free to type a question in the chat box if you have one. I have a question, and since I'm moderating, I guess I have the privilege of asking first. But as you were going through all of this, I couldn't help but wonder, how did you get started in all of this? Like, what either inspired you to go into this line of work, or how did you find yourself in the midst of all of this integrated ecology?
Yeah, thanks. That's I would say by the grace of God. My parents met in the army. My parents met in the army. And so I grew up in Tennessee. So I'm from the South. I'm from like an army family. So like being an environmentalist vegetarian living in Cleveland, Ohio was probably not what anybody thought my future path was, least of all me. I would just say that I got really interested in ecology when I went to college. I went to Smith College for a year, which is like a really hippy dippy college in Western Massachusetts. And then I transferred to Boston College and just started learning more. And then when I moved to Cleveland as a Jesuit volunteer, I fell in love with the city and wanted to stay. And so at the end of my volunteer year, I had an opportunity to teach at our Cristo Rey School here in Cleveland. And the course that I got to teach was an ecological spirituality course, which was just like my dream. And one of the things that I really suddenly realized being in this new community was that talking about the redwood trees and whales was not going to maybe speak to where my students were at in the city of Cleveland. And so we talked a lot about, there was a tire burning plant that was trying to locate itself in our neighborhood. And so we kind of took that route and we were like, oh, well, I was coaching cross country. There were already dead birds like on the sidewalk near one of the factories that we ran by every single day. I was like, that can't be good. We definitely don't need more air pollution. Right. And so then we got, I guess like, it was just mostly from my students, right? Like I was talking about things in a very theoretical way. It was my first year teaching and I was like, lead poisoning, I was about to go into this like really theoretical thing. And like one of my students was like, oh, I had that, DeMario like raised his hand. And I was just like, yes, right? So like your lived experience is like, this isn't just a theoretical kind of thing to study, right? These are real people's lives and real people are being impacted. So I would say that my students at St. Martin have definitely like really guided me in my journey.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Fascinating how you came to that. Thank you for sharing. We do have a question in the chat box, which was something that I was wondering as well. If you could, do you have any additional insights or details you can share about the copper mining that is happening near sacred lands? The question is specific. Mary Johnson asked if, like, how is that occurring? Does it not belong to the tribe? Like, what additional information do you have to offer there?
Right. And I will drop information in the chat because I do not know all of like the technical legal mumbo jumbo that was happening, but basically the land belongs to the tribe, but because of like a leasing treaty back in the day, like their companies could still have access to the mineral rights. So that is like a very laywoman's definition of what is happening. And basically it was recently good news. So there's the Save Oak Flat legislation that I can link to in the chat. So that's something that you can contact your legislators about, but they just got news from a court that is kind of sending it back. So it was going to go to the Supreme Court, but I think they're having more conversation about it. Most of what I know is from the students and teachers at Brophy Prep. So I am happy to give you more knowledgeable people in the chat.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I know that situations like that arise quite frequently with the land leasing on tribal land. So that makes a lot of sense. Another question that I had, and if someone else has one, please, again, feel free to drop in the chat or bring yourself off of mute. You've made a couple comments during the presentation about we all have different gifts and talents, and there are different ways that we can become involved. And you mentioned a couple during the course of your presentation, but I was wondering if you could either maybe point to like a specific example of something you've seen in the community, either through individual work or parish, that you would want to highlight, you'd want to leave us with.
Yeah, I think, well, I do think that Brophy Prep has done an amazing job. I would say, for example, last year we did that Renewing the Earth series, and Brebeuf Jesuit in Indianapolis. They did kind of like a reforestry project, and they pulled in, so they had a lot of non-native species in this land that they owned. So they were learning about it in science classes, they had it removed. And then like one student was like, oh, I saw this thing on TikTok for how to grow plants in milk jugs. And then another student was like, oh, I can do the promotion for that. Like I have graphic design skills, so I'll like make this very beautiful poster to get people to bring in their milk jugs. And then another student like made these really cute like descriptors of all of the native flowers that they were going to plant in place of the invasive species. And so it was just kind of like people were pulling in their talents. Like some students were more interested in the gardening, some students were more interested in like organizing people and getting people to do the same thing. So that's kind of where I've seen it in our network. Another little example that I like to use is I think his name is Goji the fish. So there is just like this giant fish installation. I usually have a picture in my slides, but a giant fish installation on a beach that had a lot of plastic pollution. And so it's like this big empty fish, and an artist made it and put a sign next to it and was like, my name is Goji. I like to eat plastic. Please feed me your plastic. And so then, because it was just like this novel kind of piece of art, and it gave people a place to throw their trash, like people threw their trash there instead of on the ground. And it was, it was just like this kind of creative solution to a problem that was, embedded in somebody's kind of talents that they were willing to share.
I have a question.
Yes.
You pointed us towards the action platform, the 7 points. They are quite broad. It's not a critique. Let me finish. And then the integral ecology. The racial justice. The justices, I will add economic justice to that. And when one thinks about the issue of the times, it's just that environment, global warming, climate change, all the management of natural resources, it just like supersedes migration and poverty, because that everything, those issues of poverty, injustice, they will become worse with what is happening with the environment. Now, when I read Ladocity and I listen to all these people that are experts in this area, it's very complex, because what do you do? There is global warming, there are the local issues, very much in the community, then the climate change, but there are global warming, and I tell myself, and climate change are very important. And a lot of the problems that we have are driven by the companies, by the big companies, and the governments, and our government, because they are involved with the capitalists and they don't take decisions. So what do you think? Because that's my question. Sometimes I think, what do you think about ecological education, about moving people on or advocacy, rather than focusing in this little thing and this other little thing? Because there are, in the care for home, that the Pope talks about, caring for home, take us to little things. I am an economist. So, but you have to look at the bigger thing that make the bigger changes, you see, because this is an emergency.
Right.
That's the way I see it. What is happening in Colorado, what is happening in Europe, with the energy that one person can decide because they have already resources, and all those things come together. So what do you think about that, about sponsoring, helping, supporting the bigger issues through education, through advocacy, through providing information, to moving the young people, because the young people are the ones who will do it. I don't think people of my time or before, I mean, we can do, but it's not in our hands. Actually, my children said, you were the ones and before who destroyed the earth. It's kind of your fault because you didn't do anything. So, what is your opinion? How would you approach that? What you had money and what would you do? What would you support?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's like a really, a real tension of this time. But just to put my spiritual director hat on for a moment, just seeing you speak so passionately about those issues of education and advocacy kind of seems like a spark of God in you, right? Like you are very passionate about that. And that's what we need, are people who feel passionately and energized. I think, I guess I agree with you. At ISN, we do education and advocacy. So that's why I'm in this role and the work that I do. I did just put in the chat our federal advocacy talking points for the Ignatian Family Teach-In, where we're going to invite young people to go talk to their legislators at the end of the month about the changes, the federal changes that we need to see rapidly and at a federal and global level. So yes, and right. So I think we need to educate. I think, thinking about like healing and reconciliation, your children are right. Like you were a part of the problem, right? But that also then implicates you in being a part of the solution, right? Like if you're a part of this process, like we all are, we need to do this intergenerationally. I think I often get frustrated, and I'm not that young, I'm 34, but I get really, sometimes it feels hard when I hear people say, oh, well, like young people have it, they're going to figure it out. And I'm kind of like, well, I'm 34 and I'm going to see like closer to the end of the century than you are. So like, I appreciate that you have confidence in me, but also I would like for you to work with me and for us to do this together, because I think people still have many skills to share. So if I had all the money in the world, right, like I would invest it in rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels. That is something that we know we need to do. But I also think there's a book called We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer, and it's one of my, it's a very good book. And in it, he says, we will not stop climate change by changing what we eat for breakfast. But unless we change what we eat for breakfast, we cannot stop climate change, right? So it's a both and. He's talking about moving away from eating so much meat and how that actually is very carbon intensive. And so I think like we have to do both. It's the 2 feet of love in action. We need to take the small actions in our own lives, because if we're not doing it in our own lives, then we're not going to feel motivated to call our representative and to knock on their doors and to call the big companies, right? So we need both. We need people who are responding to the needs of migrants at the border. Like, we need people to be filling the real needs and issues that we're experiencing today. So that's why we need everyone. And so again, I just want to reiterate, you spoke so eloquently and so beautifully and with such passion about education and advocacy, and like, what is God putting on your heart, or what might God be calling you? How might God be calling you to contribute, I guess, is my question back, that you don't have to answer, but just is to all of us.
Thank you so much, Brenna. This has been such an enlightening discussion. Your time is so greatly appreciated. Unfortunately, we're already over time and we don't have time to jump into all of the questions, but we're certainly happy to continue this discussion offline, and maybe we can answer some of them through email. I want to thank everyone that has joined us. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week and that we see you again next week. Brenna, again, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. Again, your time is so very appreciated. There's claps all around if you can't see the screen. All clapping on Zoom.
Can I just put one
and
like
yes,
2-second plug in?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Amanda, because I know we're over time, but I did
No,
put in the
no,
chat.
please.
There's a link. It's it says interconnected in it, and we did a 21-day environmental justice challenge. So it's an education and advocacy challenge where you learn how different environmental issues are interconnected with, you know, migrant workers, with racial justice. How does redlining impact urban heat islands? So it's just, it's one of the things that I've worked on that I've been the most proud of. We worked with the Catholic Climate Covenant and Ladocity movement, the Sisters of Mercy. And I just think it's been a good program to help people who haven't been able to make those connections to do that. So I just wanted to put the word out about that. And then also our advocacy talking points are in the chat. So if you're interested in learning more about oak flat and mineral reform, you can look at it there. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And we're certainly happy to include that in an email to the group as well. So everyone will have access to it after the Zoom meeting ends as well. So thank you so much. Highly appreciated. Thank you all so much for going over with us, for spending your Monday evening with us. Again, we hope to see you next week. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Monday. Thank you.
Thanks, Brenna. I'll see you at ISN later this month.
See you later. Everybody's welcome.
I'm trying to get
Thank you
them
very
there.
much, Brenna. It's wonderful. And Amanda, thank you for your facilitating.
Yes.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you. As much